I'm David Korn.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton.
And we're Blogging Heads TV.
We got that right.
Yet again, well, Happy New Year, Jim. It's been weeks since we faced off on the honorable battlegrounds of Blogging Heads TV. I know the public has been sorely disappointed.
I think they survived, but why risk it?
Yes. Well, I understand that sale of hard liquor is up in the time period. It's not just because of the holiday season. Anyway, I was gone. I was out of Washington for actually a couple of weeks, and I returned to Washington, much as it is, except everything being a little bit worse, especially for George W. Bush. And I came back and right away jumped into the trial of Lewis Scooter Libby. In fact, so devoted am I to Blogging Heads TV that I left the trial day 2 a bit early today in order to be here with you.
Well, what did you learn?
Well, so far the trial has just been jury selection. And the key question has been, to the jurors that is, do you believe the Bush administration? Again and again, as they go through potential jurors, looking for 18 people, 12 jurors, 6 alternates, they've been asking them what they think about the Bush administration's credibility, particularly on the question of the war in Iraq and what brought us to the war in Iraq, and particularly regarding a fellow named Dick Cheney, who may or may not end up being a witness for Scooter Libby in this trial. And there have been a few jurors who very honestly have said, I wouldn't trust anything anyone in this administration has to say. And they've been booted immediately. Apparently, if you support this administration, you don't get booted. But there have been a few who have raised doubts about the administration and Cheney's credibility, but who have said that they still think they can fairly evaluate Dick Cheney as a witness should it come to that. I expect those people to be bounced later in the process when the defense team can use their preemptory challenges, but they're not being bounced in, say, the automatic drop phase of the jury trial. But for those of you who are following this closely, I know most Blogging Heads TV people do, we're going to have a couple of days more of jury selection. Friday is a day off for the judge. And then they were hoping to get to opening arguments and the first witnesses and the prosecution side on Monday. May happen. If not, it'll probably happen Tuesday.
This is my chance to learn, too, and you always think about, jury selection in an urban environment like D.C. I mean, the cliche is that the only people who agree to be jurors are, retired black postal workers. What's just more detail on it? What's the jury like? What's the jury pool like?
That's actually not the case. Yesterday, I walked upstairs to the courtroom and saw the line of about 100 potential jurors, and it was much more mixed. That means more white people than one would expect, and they looked, pretty affluent, as if they were lining up to go into a decent restaurant. And so there have been lots of professional types, not just retired postal workers, though a few former government officials, and a few surprises, or at least the amusing moments. There are a lot of amazing things that some people who appear who are Washington D.C. residents admit fully that they don't bother reading the newspaper, that they know nothing about the case, that they barely know who Bush and Dick Cheney are, and none of these prospective jurors, and I think we've heard from about 25, 26 of them so far, have mentioned reading any blogs except maybe 1 or 2. And it just seems that, for all the time you and I spend trying to reach people and persuade them as to the affairs of state, most are doing other things with their time. They're certainly not watching Blogging Heads TV. So in the press room, again and again, there's lots of groans as people say they don't bother paying attention to the news media. They're too busy walking their dogs. There was one woman up there who works for Lockheed Martin Information Technology. Who says she's chasing $1 billion now in federal contracts, and that she has great respect for the commander-in-chief. Now, if I'm Libby's side, I want her on the jury. Mr. Libby may still know some people giving out federal contracts. Then there were a few people who got up there and said, I have definitive views on this administration, and I could not believe anything anyone from it said. They were allowed to go home early. And there were a few people who come in really coached to give the right answers. I believe in presumption of innocence, and I've never thought about this case before. No, I'm very well read, but I don't have any defined opinions.
So these are the ones who want to get picked so they can write a book about the experience.
Something. I mean, I feel like Gene Hackman in the movie The Jury, saying that person wants to be on this jury. You have to figure out why. But it is rather fascinating. But as I said, the lead question so far has been, people's attitudes towards the credibility of the administration, even though that's supposed to not be at issue in this trial. And they probably will, get enough people who at least do a good job of hiding their feelings or claiming they don't have them.
Well, I must say that much of my exposure to this trial is the endless number of letters and emails I'm getting from Republicans around town. Don't we think that Scooter Libby ought to be pardoned immediately and so on? I mean, so the Scooter Libby defense spin, pardon, raise money for his legal team circle is enormous.
Oh, they believe that he should be pardoned.
Yeah, they pardon him right now.
Right now,
they demand a pardon right now.
Well, on what grounds? I mean, you have a guy appointed by the number 2 man in the Bush Justice Department, claiming that he lied to a federal grand jury and to FBI agents. Why
I guess they argue, well, there's no crime, and they kind of blame it on Fitzgerald, and so I mean, anyway. It's just I've never quite seen anything quite like it, where I guess the Ford preemptive pardon of Nixon has kind of got them thinking, maybe that's the way to do it. Don't bother with the trial, just get right to the pardon.
Well, there's no doubt that Libby and others around him have been, thinking about that. The interesting thing is whether or not they will end up calling Dick Cheney at the end of the day. I have to believe that despite all the vetting they're doing on this jury, that most jurors will not, be favorably disposed, Washington jurors, to Dick Cheney, and for him to come out and say, in essence, that Scooter Libby is a fine man who was too busy helping me run the Iraq War to remember to tell the truth, is just not going to, sway too many minds. Again, you only need one or so to block a jury here, but it also is going to put Cheney a little bit in the crosshairs. Patrick Fitzgerald has been very clear on this, since he spoke after putting down the indictment, in saying this case is very narrowly defined as to whether or not Scooter Libby told the truth about talking about Joseph Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame, and not about anything else, even though other people want to make it about other matters. And, but part of the campaign that went on to discredit or destroy, however you want to put it, Joe Wilson, during which Karl Rove and Scooter Libby ended up talking about Joe Wilson's wife, well, Fitzgerald has already introduced evidence showing that Dick Cheney was very much involved in that campaign. So if he comes and testifies, I imagine that there will be a lot of questions put to him about that and his role and what he was talking to Scooter about at the time. Those are things that I imagine the White House would rather not see publicly aired. And so I wonder if, calling Dick Cheney to the stand is something that is going to help Scooter Libby get a pardon or not.
Well, all the more reason for the pardon now.
Yeah. Well, right. Save Dick Cheney, pardon Scooter Libby. I just gave you the bumper sticker. But anyway, this trial is going to go on for a couple of weeks. Opening arguments, as I say, maybe Monday or Tuesday. The prosecution tells us that they will take about 2 weeks, 8 days, and they're not doing the case on Fridays, to present their case. And then we'll go to the defense side, and they could just rest and say, we're not going to do anything. But people are expecting them to try to destroy Fitzgerald's case, and that could take another 2 to 3 weeks in trying to do that. So I don't know how long I'm going to last, but there will be some interesting days, no doubt, and we'll see if Cheney actually comes to the courthouse to testify, or whether they go on a field trip to the Naval Observatory, where they have a wonderful astronomical clock, to take the Vice President's testimony, or whether they'll agree at some point at the end to have some sort of deposition-type deal, as they did with Ronald Reagan in the Oliver North trial. But I I'm happy to watch Law and Order type Republicans call for a pardon now. I mean, there was nothing illegal about getting a blowjob, and yet they still wanted Bill Clinton prosecuted for lying. So, as we say, sometimes it is the cover-up. But I'll be, people can, look at my blog, and it'll be all over the blogosphere. I'll be reporting from the Libby trial, and we'll see how things develop. Hey, do you know him at all?
I've never met him.
No. Now, that's not plausible. What are you hiding, Jim Pinkerton?
I don't recall.
See, now, if he had said that, there'd be no problem.
Yeah, my story is changing already. No, I can remember the first time I heard the name was in the transition back in 2000. I said, Scooter Libby, what kind of name is that? And then that was, my impression of him for quite some time. And it was only, very shortly thereafter that all the Mark Rich pardon stuff came out. We're talking now, I guess, just like January 2001, when Bill Clinton was still in office, and it was sort of kind of an eyebrow raiser to me that this guy was simultaneously Mark Rich's lawyer and the incoming Vice President's Chief of Staff. I thought that was kind of strange.
Well, yes, I hope he was well paid at least for one of those gigs. Well, of course, I think this is a good time for a transition. The Libby trial comes at a moment when the president's credibility regarding Iraq is at a low point. You think it can't get any lower, but perhaps it might. Last poll I saw showed that only 26% of Americans approve of the way he's handling the war. In fact, he went on 60 Minutes and said, hey, if I was asked that question, I'd say I don't approve of what's going on there either. Fire the bum. Oh, that's me. But we're now into sort of the post, or it's not even post, the surge period. I look around Washington. I see maybe about 6 or 7 people supporting the president in his Iraq policy now, and they all write for the Weekly Standard. Take away the Weekly Standard, and he's down to the dog and his wife. What do you make of the surge as policy, and where this has brought the president politically?
Well, I think obviously it's a very difficult situation. I mean, the support for the war is at 29 or whatever it is, and yet, interesting enough, Bush's popularity is still in the low 30s. I think at the last poll I saw was like 34. So there's a fair number of people who just plain give him the benefit of the doubt because he's the president, and he's the commander-in-chief, and they're Republicans, or probably mostly Republicans, and they like him, and that's that. However, I do agree that the commentary from the Beltway and from the intelligentsia, if you will, and I use that term, loosely.
So that you and I fit within it.
Any club that would have us as a member, obviously, can't be too demanding. Has been pretty negative, and in part, a prominent Republican made the point to me this morning that, look, if you agree with President Bush, as this is the prominent Republican now.
You found one.
I did. If you agree with President Bush, as I do, the prominent Republican, that we have to win in Iraq, then we're not doing it right.
Right.
And his point was, that where's General Petraeus? I mean, I'm not exactly sure on this, but I guess he hasn't yet taken command. I mean, he should have been there yesterday.
Right.
We shouldn't be sending 20,000 troops. We should be sending 100,000 troops. Now there's almost he had such a good argument to make against the prospects of a 15% increase. That's 15 percentage increase from 140 to 160 or whatever the actual number is. That making any difference in a country of 25 million. That I've almost started to wonder whether some of these Republicans who are sort of nominally allied with Bush on the war have sort of are getting to an intellectual point where they say, look, either win or get out. And if you can't win, then as a matter of logic, you have to get out.
Right.
It's sort of what George Wallace said about Vietnam. George Wallace, in a funny way, had the same position on Vietnam as did, Bobby Kennedy or Eugene McCarthy in 1968, because it was, in fact, John Wallace, who was obviously no liberal, was saying, get out.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, two small points. One is it's going to take weeks and weeks, I'm told by military people, to get those 20,000 troops in, not right away, whether Petraeus is there or not. But I forgot the other point, but it was a small point, so I forgot a small thing. But it's interesting to watch today, Senator Brownback of Kansas, an arch social conservative who thinks he's running for president, get out there and give again up the ante on his opposition to the war, or at least to the surge, and saying, heck, if the Iraqis don't want peace themselves, why should Americans care? The sort of the part of the blame and run camp, which I think is somewhat of a conservative impulse to a degree. It's the opposite of do-gooding, which is I think where George Wallace was coming from. Hey, if the Vietnamese can't get their act together, why should we lose American boys over this, and why now should we lose American boys and girls, gals and guys, over Iraq if the Iraqis can't put their own country together in the absence of Saddam Hussein's tyranny.
And by the way, I think Brownback, who I know reasonably well, is a very thoughtful guy, and I think he's really taken it very seriously. The vote he made and the lives have been lost as a result of that vote with the majority back 4.5 years ago now. And I think there's a fair amount of soul searching like that. Another Republican who's sort of in a similar category is Representative Walter Jones of North Carolina, who represents it's the 3rd congressional district down there.
Right.
He represents or has adjoining, I'm not sure exactly which, Camp Lejeune, which is the headquarters of the Marines, the Cherry Point Naval Air Station, and some huge veterans hospital. It's a district that's absolutely thick with military and retired military. And Jones flipped on the war a couple of years ago. Is a vehement, and in part because he had the experience of writing condolence letters, which a task he took upon for himself to write a condolence letter to every family that had lost a loved one in Iraq. And he's written and signed personally thousands and thousands of letters. And interesting enough, he's having a press conference tomorrow in the House Press Gallery.
That would be on Thursday.
Thursday, whatever that, yeah. With Congressman Abercrombie, of course, is a Democrat. Congressman Meehan,
very liberal Democrat,
from Hawaii. Congressman Meehan from Massachusetts, and then also Congressman Bartlett of Maryland, is a Republican, and I think maybe one or two more. And they're going to have a press conference on it's either on the surge or it's on Iran. I'm not sure which, but they're definitely having something tomorrow where they're going to stake out a position, demanding that the president get. I guess it's on Iran. Confirmation from the Congress before any military action against Iran. And, of course, that's, as you know, David, the buzz going through town is the real gist of Bush's speech last week was the warning marker he laid down relative to Iran and Syria. Yeah. With the prospect of a replay of the invasion of Cambodia.
It reminds me, there's been a lot of gambling cliches used to describe the point that Bush is at Iraq, doubling down and such, bad money after good. But it seems one cliche that I haven't seen much of use so far is like if you start losing, or if you are losing at the blackjack table, then you sort of move over to the roulette wheel. And you widen the war and give that a shot. Go after Iran. Sam Gardner, former retired Air Force colonel, who I was watching this, did a piece a couple of days ago, which I put up on my blog, davidcorn.com. I'll put a link over here on this page, pointing at all the warning signs that they're actually getting serious about doing some sort of attack on Iran. And we'll see if we get to that. Also, a lot of stuff on Iraq on Wednesday today. Senator John Sununu, who I don't know if you're close to him. He's the son of the fellow who was chief of staff of the first Bush White House when you were over there. He came out with some very critical remarks about the escalation of the war, a Republican from New Hampshire. And Hillary Clinton came...
Up for re-election in 2008, by the way.
That's right.
Sununu, that is.
Sununu is. And Hillary Clinton came back from Iraq day after Obama announced the formation of an exploratory campaign. Said she was going to introduce legislation to cap the level of troops so there can't be the Bush or McCain surge, whatever you want to call it, which is, a step forward towards her and actually something more concrete than the Senate leadership had been talking about, which is a non-binding resolution, declaring their opposition, which of course would not do anything about anything other than to declare their opposition. But you said that you had some advice about all this, this whole weighty matter, and we need as much advice as we can get these days. You had advice from the other side. Do tell. The other side.
Well, I mean, I like you, I'm old enough to remember Vietnam, and I remember the Republican president from the Sun Belt who fought that war, and obviously I'm talking about Richard Nixon, and I just sort of got to thinking about how Richard Nixon, who I realize is not your favorite president ever, and
he did create the EPA. Went to China after red-baiting people. Yes.
How he went about ending the Vietnam War, because all the literature in the last few weeks has been said, well, just like Nixon invaded Cambodia in 1970 and then had an incursion into Laos in 1971, well, this is what Bush is doing or might be doing with Iraq, with the surge, and maybe also with Syria and Iran. And I got to thinking about that analogy and whether I thought that was accurate and, frankly, whether that was fair to Richard Nixon. And I realize not everybody out there is worried about fairness to Richard Nixon. But there was an interesting point. So in my column for Tuesday, I imagined that Richard Nixon, through my Ouija board, came back to talk to me about this. And I said, no,
Jim? Now, is this the drunk Richard Nixon or the sober?
Totally sober. There are a few chains rattling as he walked around. But
Jim, it's the Jews, Jim. They got us. Those neoconservatives, Jim.
Anyway, I mean, the point that if you will, or I'll use my own voice now and just say the point that Nixon is worth remembering about what he accomplished in the Vietnam era was that at the same time he was escalating the war into Cambodia in 1970 and to Laos and accelerating the bombing of North Vietnam in 1972 and so on. I mean, it was more than that. At the same, he was also he was the first U.S. president to go to China.
Right.
He was the first U.S. president to visit Moscow, and he, in effect, well, not in effect, he did reach some level of understanding with the patrons of North Vietnam, the Chinese and the Russians. He said, "Look, we're gonna get peace with honor. We're gonna bomb the crap out of North Vietnam, and then we're gonna leave, and you're gonna sort of twiddle your thumbs while we do this, because we're making an arrangement to Nixon was playing Russia and China off against each other,
right.
Offered the Chinese in effect diplomatic recognition, offered the Russians American wheat, whatever it was he offered them, and so Nixon was able to radically escalate the Vietnam War in the early 70s, and if you will, get away with it. And the parallel there for Iraq and the situation with the Iranians is if we think, just as Nixon isolated North Vietnam in effect from its patrons, China and Russia, so this president, to succeed, will have to either isolate the Iraqi insurgents from the Iranians, or if that's impossible, then isolate Iran from its patrons, who are also, coincidentally, Russia and China. The Russians, as we all seen, are busy selling air defense systems to the Iranians. They're certainly not respecting any kind of sanctions or UN restrictions or embargoes on Iran. And meanwhile, the Chinese are busy pouring money into Iranian oil fields.
Right.
So the Bush administration will, if they were really serious about being successful in Iraq/Iran, they would be engaged in heroic diplomacy with Moscow and Beijing, saying, what do you have to have in return for your help on this Iran-Iraq situation? And to my knowledge, the Bush administration has sort of been doing the opposite. They've been sort of antagonizing, especially Russia, on this and that. And again, not to say the Russians are anything other than dictators and neo-Stalinists. I'm not meant to defend Putin at all. It's just, if you're a nation trying to play a diplomatic game, you have to be disciplined and focused. How many enemies can I make at once? And if you've got enough enemies with Iraq and Iran, then it behooves you to do whatever it takes to conciliate Iraq and Iran's patrons.
Well, that also might entail, chewing gum and walking down the street at the same time, which they really don't seem to, they promised they could do this before the war in Afghanistan was finished, they turned towards Iraq. It turns out, of course, that they can't. And, you who've served in the White House, unlike I can tell that, can tell our audience, that is, that, some problems, some things become so big, so large, that they do become all-consuming. And I think the Baker Commission tried to put a larger frame on the Iraq problem. Whether it would be successful or not, is anyone's guess. But Bush, to him, the larger frame seems to be we may have to go after Iran, because we're failing in Iraq. And I don't know anybody in town other than maybe Charles Krauthammer who's cheering on that very threatening possibility.
Yeah, I think Dick Morris, who worked closely with the Clinton White House.
That would be the toe-sucking Dick Morris.
Who was not perfect.
If you don't know, Google it, okay?
But a smart fellow. Made the point that any second-term president eventually becomes preoccupied with one thing.
Right.
Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam, Nixon in Watergate, Carter in the Iran hostage crisis. I realize Carter's only a one-term president, not a two-term president. But anyway, so forget the second-term part. Just any president toward the end of his term in office winds up only thinking about one particular topic. And Morris's point, and he's sort of a guarded supporter, I suppose, of President Bush, is certainly no fan of the Democrats these days, said that this current President Bush has, in effect, become the mayor of Baghdad. And that speaks poorly to his ability to deal with, let alone domestic issues back here at home, but even the larger geopolitical Clausewitzian context.
Well,
that we find ourselves in.
I mean, that's true, but if he was the mayor of Baghdad, he might actually understand things a little bit better. So that'd be a step up, But one point before I let you get away with your great game theorizing, as you just did in bringing the spirit of Richard Nixon into our conversation, one sort of painful reminder here is that between 68 and 74, while Nixon was indeed, doing all that and setting up for an eventual withdrawal, 20,000, 25,000, whatever the number is, more Americans died for essentially nothing. So the cost of trying to get your ducks in order and do this in a certain way, if you're going to be withdrawing at the end of the day, is not inconsequential.
You're right, but I would say in Nixon's defense, I'm really not on this earth to defend Nixon all that much, but I would say this: that was a war he inherited. I mean,
True.
Lyndon Johnson
he had a secret plan to end it.
Presided over 35,000 Americans killed in action
in
his 5 years in the presidency, and Nixon, and another 20,000 Americans died, So
I hope Republicans are as charitable to the Democrat who becomes president after Bush as you were just to Richard Milhouse Nixon. But speaking of Democrats, this is really pretty good. Speaking of Democrats who might inherit the mess, Barack Obama, through his halo into the ring, quasi-announced the formation of an exploratory committee which allows him to raise funds without making a full commitment to running. Yesterday he did it on his website in a video announcement that seemed to be 20 seconds long, maybe it was 2-3 minutes long. I found it kind of vague and a little bland, even though I like the guy. But no surprise to you, I'm sure.
Well, other than the fact that Obama, a year ago, Obama was just a junior senator from Illinois who'd given a pretty good keynote speech for the Democrats in Boston a couple of years ago. I think I at least have been sort of surprised by the absolute electrifying reaction that Obama has generated from Democrats and from the media, and I think he, I have to say now, he represents a real threat to Hillary Clinton's presidential prospects.
What do you make of him?
I think he's... my own guess is that he's sort of a left liberal who's learned sort of at the foot of E.J. Dionne how to talk better and in terms of being looking like modern. I mean, like E.J. Dionne is a liberal who is smart and talks a game. Not a game is wrong word. I take that back.
Okay.
Talks in a manner that reassures moderates that, hey, liberalism isn't so bad. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
You know, that's a perfectly plausible way to present liberalism. You know, and on the other hand, you know, Obama is sort of this is sort of the cliche of the moment here in the Beltway, kind of a Rorschach test. You know, if you think he stands for liberalism, you like him. If you think he stands for sort of a non-Al Sharpton-like African American, you like him for that reason. You know, you sort of like Jimmy Carter in 1976. You kind of pour whatever you want into him, and he's vague enough and not specific enough that you can kind of get away with it.
Now, what do you think of the experience question? I mean, I've met the man a few times. I'm very impressed with him just as a person. He's as smart, if not smarter than any other politician you'll come across. He's a good study. I was talking to a military guy, no liberal, former major general the other day, who was called into Obama's office to talk about veterans issues and then talked about some strategic issues involving Iraq and Iran. And he went in there prepared to see him as a quasi-lightweight. He walked out, he told me, tremendously impressed. He with his listening abilities, his ability to process and analyze information, what seemed to be his sincerity, and he does have, without being showy about it, he has that Clinton quality of making you think that that what you care about, what you think about, is really tremendously important to him while he's focusing on you. And this guy walked out. He doesn't know whether he's going to end up supporting him. Thinking, God, he is the real thing. But anyway, I started off by asking you what you thought about the experience question.
David, that's really a great point. That's look, one of the political arts that is cultivated around this town is the ability to make people think that you're smart by being a good listener. How dumb can this person be if he agrees with me? And Clinton, who I do agree was smart,
right.
And Obama, who I have no opinion on. Obviously, he's not stupid. Obviously, it is hard to point to much in his record in anything other than simply being a 45-year-old guy who was married to 2 kids that really speaks to some achievement or vision or gutsy position or something like that. But in terms of getting elected, in terms of not being Hillary Clinton, in terms of not being a Republican, those may well be the strongest assets he has going for him in 2007 and 2008.
At this stage of the game, and there are about 37 potential candidates now. But if you look at the real candidates, you put him up against. Should he find a way to vanquish Hillary Clinton? A big if we can talk about another time. But should he do that, you put him up against any other of the possible Republicans, with maybe the exception of McCain, and he has a pretty good fighting chance. And McCain, is gathering deficits by the day. The Senate, Senate Brownback, who's considering running, former Governor Gilmore. I don't know who, Huckabee, the governor of Arkansas. Giuliani may be the only other Republican with sort of star quality, if he can get the nomination, who could sort of, trump a Democrat, regardless of who the Democrat is. But, pound for pound, just in terms of a person's, you put inside a resume, just in terms of, the person versus the person, he does seem to stack up pretty well.
I agree. I agree from the point of view of a moderate voter who, if a moderate voter today, according to the polls, will disapprove of President Bush and will think the country is moving in the wrong direction. And, I worked in the 1988 George H.W. Bush 41 for president campaign, and that was the first time in a long time that a party had won a third consecutive term in the White House.
Right.
The last time since 1948, and so I knew how hard it was then, just based on the sort of the general exhaustion and boredom the voters have with 2 terms. And that was when Reagan was, for the most part popular, and I think the right track for the country was about 60 right track, and now it's 35 or whatever it is, and if that doesn't get better, in 2008, and I think the Democrats are looking very formidable. But again, that's not a big shock given the Iraq War and how it's gone. The real shock has been Obama's appeal within the Democratic Party, and I was struck, as I'm sure you were, by a poll from KCCI TV station in Iowa that had Hillary Clinton fourth.
Right.
As I recall, it was Obama and Edwards were tied, or close to being tied at like 22-21.
Right.
Then Governor Vilsack was 15, and Hillary was fourth. And I think a lot of the calculations that sort of Beltway Democrats have made, well, I have to be with Hillary because, of course, she's going to win, and so that means a lot to me in terms of a Clinton 2 administration, might have been derailed a little bit. And if Hillary's inevitability is taken away, and she just has to sell herself on the merits, including this Iraq War, which I'm sure you agree is a major monkey on her back, and won't be undone because now, 4+ years later, she's saying, "Well, I'm against the surge."
Right.
You tell me, David, how Democrats will react to that.
I don't make really too many predictions, but I am predicting now that the war will be the defining issue of the Democratic presidential primary, and the question will be, what have you done to stop it, and when did you do that? Barack Obama, of course, has no original sin burden because he was not in the Senate when they voted to give Bush the power to invade Iraq. And then at the time he did say he opposed that. So he right off starts in a better position. Hillary's now obviously trying to play some sort of catch-up with the bill she's introduced to cap the troops. So that still, I don't think, is going to end up satisfying Democratic primary voters 2 years down the road if we're still anywhere near this mess.
1 year. 1 year.
Excuse me, 1 year down the road. When they want to see more than just a cap in the troops, they want to see troops coming home and the war over. And I'll just end with another cliche, which is politics is always about a choice, and one's negatives can be as more powerful than one's positive, as the George W. Bush campaign of 2004 proved with John Kerry. We often evaluate people on their own, but you can't evaluate Hillary now without looking at Obama, and you won't be able to evaluate the Republican candidate of 2008 without looking at the Democrat. It's a relative choice. So the guy may not have the experience that you'd like to see, but at the end of the day, you're still going to judge him opposite whoever else is running, whatever their negatives and positives are.
I agree with that. The only thing I'd add, and this is another question to you, is will the left, the anti-war, dovish element of the Democratic Party, which is pretty substantial.
Well, the anti-war element is of everywhere is pretty substantial.
Fair enough. Will they put such a premium on an actual attempt to defund the war? It's one thing just simply to vote for a non-binding resolution that doesn't do anything. Will there be any kind of bidding competition, if you will, among 08-minded Democrats to say who's going to go the furthest?
Well, there will be. And, you already have what you call a second-tier candidate like Dennis Kucinich making that argument that he's for defending the war, the others aren't. John Edwards the other day, said that if you're in Congress, you have an obligation to stop the war. The fact that he's no longer in the Senate makes life much easier for him. I do think there will be, people will be trying to make those cases and make those divisions, and it will come from the candidates who will be responding to, I think, the natural desires on part of the Democratic primary voters, and there may be a desire that goes even beyond, what might have in the past been called the left wing of the party. It could, be the broad part of the party, and even general election voters might be looking at this debate and taking notice. But we'll be talking about this, I think, a lot in the coming few months. We mentioned choice a moment ago. Next week, of course, Bush gets to make yet another big speech, the State of the Union address. And a choice that a White House always has at moments like this is what's going to be the big news, the big surprise, the new idea. I'll probably get around writing this the next few days. My take is that this State of the Union doesn't matter. No one's listening to Bush. All anyone cares about is what he has to say about Iraq. He's had his say. No one buys it. Whatever he has to say about the deficit, taxes, health care, Medicare, Social Security, doesn't matter. And as a parlor game, I'm kind of wondering, what sort of, new ideas is he going to trot out? 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we had this big mission to Mars, which he quickly forgot about. He's talked about, cars that run on Wonder Bread, whatever, alternative energy a few times. Today, maybe as a prelude, he started talking about the fact that the rate of cancer has gone down, as if he's had something to do with that. So, again, give us your experience working in a White House coming up to the big prom night of the State of the Union. What are the policy and speechwriters doing, and what might they be doing, to help Bush here?
Well, of course, you're sort of tuned out on Bush, except as a journalist, and I certainly agree. Many Americans are. However, inside the bureaucracy, the various bureaucracies across town, and inside the various constituencies in town, there's still a lot of enthusiasm for getting their issue into the State of the Union.
Yes.
It makes a big deal. It makes a big difference. And so there's a lot of lobbying. And so, among the issues that you've heard discussed is simply as some sort of initiative. And the argument they make to the president and the White House speechwriter staff is, look, this will make news. This will get the subject off of this. You'll surprise people. You'll make a major constituency happy. I've heard the cancer one. I've also heard more on energy independence, which does have a lot of support among lots of different people, including on the left, including lots of people on the right.
Yeah, military people. Jim Woolsey, former CIA director Frank Gaffney, very far right, military guy, and how their energy independence initiatives.
Right, and also then you also hear about global warming to some extent as something that the president might launch some initiative on. However, I do agree that, echoing what I quoted Dick Morris saying earlier, that the president will be mostly focused on Iraq. That's really what's on his mind.
Do you really think that that's what the speech is going to do? I thought the speech would have little on Iraq. See last week's speech.
That it means that whatever he says about other topics won't have much impact because the Congress will know that the president will be preoccupied for the next 2 years, a la Lyndon Johnson.
What if he drove to the State of the Union in a Prius?
Well, that's actually a pretty good idea. Now, we'll find out whether anybody at the White House is watching Blogging Heads, but that actually would be a kind of slick idea. One of the other ripples running through Washington these days is the prospect of, however remote, and I don't think it's that remote, of some attempted deal on entitlement financing, especially Social Security. There's been a lot of rumblings that Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson has been meeting with Democrats.
Thanks, I'd forgotten who our Treasury Secretary was.
Well, that's part of the, if I were Hank Paulson and I quit a $50 million a year job at Goldman Sachs to become Treasury Secretary, I probably would say, I didn't do this just to be a potted plant.
Right.
I don't want to be another Jon Snow. I want to be somebody who remembered as doing something decisive. I won't be able to face, Bob Rubin at the next, Trilateral Commission meeting.
Davos is coming up.
Exactly. I've got to have something to show. And among the things that a Republican Treasury Secretary could show to some constituencies, sort of the Concord Coalition, budget balancing, Pete Peterson types, would be some deal on entitlement, financing, reform, whatever. There's a lot of interest in the Republican Party on some sort of partial, personal retirement accounts and so on and so on. There's a lot of enthusiasm in the Democratic Party for raising taxes. So there's a lot of resistance, by the way, too. The Republicans are strongly against tax increases. Obviously, the Democrats are strongly opposed to any kind of personal retirement accounts carved out of the Social Security system. So at the one hand, there's a lot of interest and a lot of opposition. And so I think that that's just one.
But wait a second. Let me see if I'm hearing you correctly. Are you saying there's a possibility of a tax cut? Of a tax hike coming out of the Bush administration?
Not in the State of the Union, but yes, in the next 2 years, absolutely.
Okay. Well, that's a cliffhanger. I think we should end right there. right there. Stay tuned for more on the coming tax hikes. Only on Blogging Hits TV. So anyway, Jim, this has been fun. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
Until next time.
Okay, well, I'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.